Hi everyone, thanks so much for taking the time to review my presentation today. My name is Maddie and I'm going to be talking about emotional behavioral disorders. So when we're talking about the history of the disability, I was having a really hard time finding direct links to events that happen in history that go to this disability. We'll talk about this a little bit later in the presentation, but this is due to the fact that emotional behavior disorders were commonly linked to a lot of other more prevalent disabilities. But for emotional behavioral specifically, there were three different canon events that I thought were important. So first, in 1967, you have Frank Hewitt's Santa Monica Project. Within this project, he engineered classroom design for emotionally disturbed students. So he had sample classrooms and students that were working with very rigid to not very rigid routines within a classroom where they had incentives and rewards and different practices to see which were more beneficial for emotionally disturbed children. And then in 1975, you have the Education of All Handicapped Children's Act, later the Individuals with Disability Act, which talks specifically about emotionally disturbed children, which we'll have a definition for in the next page. And then in 1990, the National Mental Health and Special Education Coalition proposed an alternative definition from emotionally disturbed to emotional and behavioral disorder. This has still not been adopted into federal law, so there are a lot of different definitions and ways to identify emotional behavioral disorders. Jumping into that, I want to focus specifically on the emotionally disturbed definition. This is if the student is exhibiting one or more of the said conditions, those conditions being the inability to learn that is not directly related to intellectual, sensory, or health matters, the inability to make or continue relationships with others, deemed inappropriate behavior or feelings, general unhappiness, or development of physical symptoms or fears when problems arise. So this is for the definition of emotionally disturbed. But if we're talking about emotional behavioral disorder, there is currently no universal known or accepted definition for this disorder. Like I mentioned in the last slide, when we're talking about the history of the disability, emotional behavior disorders really tend to overlap with a lot of other disabilities. If you say emotional behavior disorder, it's kind of this umbrella term for a lot of different things that could be happening underneath. Some of the things being schizophrenia or anxiety or depression, ADHD even, falling under this umbrella. The real specific factors we want to look at here is the extreme level of the behavior, how it is chronically arising, and that it is unacceptable. And by unacceptable, this means that the responses of the child are very different than children that are similarly their age. And that these three things, the extreme level of behavior, the fact that it is chronic, and the unacceptable behavior are impacting the child's ability to learn. And again, going back to the emotionally disturbed, it's impacting the child's ability to learn that is not on the premise of anything else, simply their behavioral and emotional responses. If we're looking at characteristics of a child with emotional behavioral disorder, you have two different types of characteristics. You have external, which are obviously ones that we can see, and internal, which are ones that are going on within the student's own mind. So some examples of external would be like aggressive, violent behavior, such as fighting, pinching, pushing, things like that. You have refusal, whether that's refusal to listen to directions, refusal to do certain tasks, anything very resistant to what someone else is telling them. Then you have kind of some volume communication styles of yelling or hissing. Mimicking is another one as well. These students tend to be very destructive, so tearing apart maybe school supplies or not taking care of their own belongings or other people's belongings. Overall, you have a lot of attention-seeking behaviors, so looking for ways to get everyone's eyes on them, whether good or bad. And then you have internal, so these students tend to be very immature for their age, very withdrawn. You have depressive episodes, general anxiety, the inability to concentrate or to collect their thoughts or to create their own thoughts, and a general lack of motivation. Some causes for emotional behavior disorder, kind of broken up into four different categories. One, you have biological disorders or diseases. So this is anything that runs within family genetics or family produced disorders, diseases, so like prenatal exposure, if the child is on medication or if they have suffered from substance abuse, whether outside of the womb or in the womb, and then any family history of mental illness as well. And then you have family relationships. So within the home, if there's any neglect or abuse, this is going to emotionally impact the student and cause them to have some of these more reactionary behaviors. And then you have their school experiences. So when they're at school, how they're interacting with peers, who they decide to be in their friend group, how they treat other people within or outside of their friend group, how they treat adults, administration, teachers, different items like that. And then you have their management skills of, are they doing their homework? Are they completing tasks? Are they studying? Are they being an active participant, an active listener? So how they behave in class also contributes to emotional behavioral. And then you have some other outside influences that could cause different behaviors to arise. So within maybe family or culture, you have different embedded demands or expectations. So for instance, if your brother was a certain way, you feel like you have to live up to that expectation. Or if your cousin is doing really well in this, then you feel like you have to do the same thing. Just kind of a lot of heavy expectations and standards that are set for yourself or from your family members or peers around you. And then obviously in this day and age, we have social media to worry about exposing our students to things at a much younger age. So now in these adolescent years, they're worried about what they look like, what their body looks like, comparing themselves to other people. And that really has a negative connotation on how they view themselves as a person and how they want themselves to look or act or behave. And then on the other side of that, we have video games, which can be ensuing violence and fighting and language that is not appropriate for these age of students. So these are a bunch of different causes that could allow this emotional behavioral disorder to thrive and kind of show itself more prevalently. If we're talking about prevention, based on these causes, there's not a lot of prevention that one person can do or not do in order for a child to not develop emotional behavioral disorder. It seems like there is a bunch of different collective items that come together to create the problems that the student is going through. So if we want to talk about prevention, making sure that as a mother, when you're carrying this child, that you are putting all of the right things in your body. As family guardians, that you're treating your child with love and respect and care, that when we're at school, we're making sure that these students have a warm and welcome environment, and that we're trying our best to monitor the online use of social media to make sure that our child or students aren't being exposed to these things. But again, that's a bunch of different things that I listed that are coming from a bunch of different people. It really takes a village to try to keep these kids safe and protected from these outside factors. But at a certain point, there's not much that we can do to prevent that. The biggest prevention piece that we can focus on is looking at how to prevent the behaviors and the emotional reactions when they're happening. And these are some impacts that we'll talk about a little bit later in the slides. So if we're talking about how emotional behavioral disorders impact an individual specifically, these reactions and impacts can be extremely varied depending on the severity. So you can look at emotional instability, behavior instability, consistent risk-taking behaviors. I just want to note about these risk-taking behaviors in this article that I read. I wanted to make it very clear that a lot of adolescents and teenagers do partake in risk-taking behaviors, but a student or a child with emotional behavior disorders is doing one or more of these consistently and is continuing to try and do and push the envelope more and more and more. And then we have academic-wise, they seem to be slower learner categories, so a lower than normal IQ. If we're looking at the social aspect of the impact on the individual, there's a lot of peer isolation that goes on when a student is doing some unfavorable actions. Other students may want to separate themselves from them because they don't want to get involved or make bad choices or do bad things or follow the wrong crowd. So then you have this child with an emotional behavior disorder that not a lot of people want to be around, and the only people that do want to be around the student are probably students that are making the same poor choices. So it's kind of a negative feedback loop there. You can also see low grades. There's a high dropout rate for students with emotional behavioral disorders, and sometimes they can be placed in highly restrictive settings. I know the school that I teach in, we have a specific program for students with emotional behavioral disorders where they spend most of their day kind of secluded from everyone else. Sometimes they're allowed to go to math, sometimes they're allowed to go to electives, excuse me, just kind of depending on their mood and behavior of that day. So how is emotional behavioral disorder identified? There is a psychiatric screening following DSM-5, but a lot of the identification actually comes from teachers themselves because they are seeing these extreme behaviors happening within the classroom. So the external ones are pretty obvious to identify: the violent outbursts, the teasing, the disruptive tendencies, stealing or lying. But the internal ones are a little bit harder to identify: the depression, anxiety, poor concentration, or short attention span. Because these are a lot of teacher-based informal diagnostics or findings, sometimes the students aren't getting all of the help that they need. In fact, emotional behavioral disorders are one of the most under-identified in the special education categories. This is due to not being able to see everything that's happening within a child's head, but also, like I mentioned before, there is a lot of overlap with emotional behavioral disorders and other disabilities, where the other disability is more prevalent than this one. So if we're talking about accommodations and modifications for students with emotional behavioral disorders, a lot of the impact and need for this child is going to be coaching. So that's in the ideas of behavioral coaching, positive relationship building, a lot of social stories to understand why their behavior is not where it's supposed to be, or why we have to act a certain way, or why we have to do things a certain way. Behavior plans can be put into place that are data-based interventions, driving the student to show and produce good and positive behaviors in order for a reward or an incentive, things like that. Other accommodations can include movement breaks, so a student can remove themselves from the setting if needed. If they seem to be getting worked up or emotional or anxious or fidgety, they can just take a moment, remove themselves, come back and rejoin the environment. There are some computer-based assistants, which we'll talk about more in the next slide. The biggest thing, though, inside the classroom, if you want to keep these children in your classroom, are going to be the nonverbal cues and preferential seating. Nonverbal cues are really important because this will give you and that student that little one-on-one attention, even though it's happening in front of everyone when no one else knows. So the student is feeling very valued and validated because you are focusing your attention on them in a very subtle way that the other students aren't going to be able to identify, but this just shows them that you're still seeing them and that you respect them and honor them and you value their space in the classroom. Same thing with preferential seating. If you set the student up close to where you were at, you can constantly check in with them, give them attention, give them that care that they want so desperately in order to keep them in your classroom and behaving the way that your classroom routines are set up. If we're talking about modifications to assignments, the biggest thing is breaking larger assignments into smaller, more manageable pieces. So it calms down the sense of anxiety or worry or stress when they're looking at a large assignment. A big thing too is implementation of choice. So giving the student options of option 1, you can write about this topic, or option 2, you can write about this topic. Giving them the element of choice makes them feel like they are making their own decisions, and they'll be more motivated to do their work and do good work, which is the most important piece. And then finally, we can look at small group testing. This is for the benefit of them and other students. If you have a student with a lot of attention-seeking behaviors, a testing environment might be disrupted by their behaviors. So if you have them within a small group, that's helpful for the other students, but then also this student is able to get some more direct one-on-one attention that they crave. In the case of computer-based assistance, you have speech-to-text or text-to-speech, which enables the student to be more interactive with their learning and the assignment. Timers and alarms are something that are really important, especially when you're trying to set up positive behaviors. So for example, you can have the student say, okay, I want you to work really hard on this assignment for 10 minutes. And then if you work really hard on this assignment for 10 minutes, then you can have a 5-minute relax or break time. So this is implementing those behaviors that you want to see for a small reward or prize. And then also the use of study guides or graphic organizers. This can be digitally or on paper, just to help them organize their thoughts. Those feelings of lack of concentration and poor focus skills can be helped when using these organizers because they have a starting point of what they need, where it goes, and things like that. So that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I have a couple of slides of my references. Again, thank you, and I'm really looking forward to the responses that you guys have.